Hello, Paul. How are you today? Is it a good time to do a Marauding Monday?
It is, of course. It's Tuesday now, so we've missed Marauding Monday. But we had a lot of issues yesterday, mate. I think 90 other developments and a couple of assessed items and a plane crash in Papua and some demonstrations. So let's call it Treacherous Tuesday and pretend it's that we haven't missed Marauding Monday. But yeah, I'm just having a sneaky glass of white wine before I take my wonderful wife to dinner. So what better way to start then, mate, on a Treacherous Tuesday than slamming two prime ministers? So pick your guy, but I'm going to pick on my own PM, Morison the muckhole, mate, from down under, from a long line of underminers. And it's interesting, mate. Firstly, I'd have to say I'm neither a Liberal or a Labor voter, which are the two major parties down under. I was a swinging voter, and though I still follow the politics down under, I don't cast a vote because I kept getting fines for not attending the Aussie embassy in Jakarta from Papua, which was, of course, 17,000 islands to the east. And of course, rather than do the $5,500 return trip for myself and the family, I just paid the $36 fine and promptly deregistered and vowed to never go back to the blunder down under. But fundamentally, you can cover off perhaps on your own PM if that's all right. Modi the man that's the toady best hid in a swamp. But for me, mate, both Modi and Morison during COVID, and in the case of Australia, throw in bushfires and some other natural disasters. And I think what we can find is, from my observation, and are you okay to cover Modi a bit later on, or would you rather pick
Most
another
certainly,
PM?
Paul.
Okay.
I just have to hope that's good for my health in terms of my own well-being.
Well, look, you live near a hospital, so you should be able to get to an AED even in India. But from what I can gather, and I'm a big believer in learning through mentorships, learning through evaluating successful leaders. But in this case, I think the talents of both Modi and Morison are very similar, mate. They've got very similar talents and traits. Firstly, they both softly appease everybody. They rise to the top on the back of genuine sleaze and yeah, a bit of a faux pas there, but I guess neither of them ever had a dirty sleeve. They manipulate the masses. Both understand that democracy, modern democracy, is nothing to do about being right. It's about fooling the fools. And if you want to fool the fools, you need to control media access to yourself, and therefore you can develop a dependent groveling media that has no objectivity, but they, like you as the politician, they grovel to you because they want power, and that's not power for designing policy or passing better bills or for the prosperity of society, but it's for the personal power, for personal gain, which they feign is for the good of society. So they put various PR pictures on it. But
Paul,
yeah,
do
sure.
you think his success is actually credited to the failures of the opposition rather than his own manipulating ways? Would you agree with that?
Partially. Look, certainly in the last election, the opposition lost the unlosable election. And the greatest problem in Australia is not the fact that they can't improvise or think or innovate or create, like, say, the Singapore government does, that has no natural resources. But Australia, that's blessed with, no land borders, so no long-term conflicts. Our biggest conflict has been brought upon ourselves by our mistreatment of our Indigenous communities. But Australia's greatest problem is ultimately its lack of values, and that has been exploited by the two political parties. And the two political parties, people think that's the problem, that there's no viable alternatives. The reality is it's a lack of values throughout society. So the Australian society is very myopic. I think I heard a South Australian politician say today, we'll be coming out of lockdown soon. We are the envy of the world. And the beautiful thing about that is, in America, Americans listened to Trump and believed that, and a big chunk of them still does. And in Australia, with all the lockdowns, with all the curtailed freedom, being told not to drink at home, they actually believe the stuff that their media and politicians, we are keeping you safe, are you? Or you're locking us down and controlling us. Now, you can get a better measure than locking people down. In the case of Melbourne, for 260 days, it's quite absurd. If you'd locked people down in Oklahoma or other states in Southern America, you would have had a whole lot more problem than one attack on Capitol Hill. And the problem with Australians, I was talking to a friend today. He said, yeah, Australians just aren't travelled, so they don't actually know. Well, no, that's not the case. Americans aren't travelled. Australians are travelled. The problem is they go to Fiji or Bali or London. And so Australia is one of the best travelled nations on earth, but not for any political enlightenment. Travel widens and broadens your aspects on earth unless you go with a mission to get heavily sunburnt in Fiji or burnt and drunk in Bali or just drunk in London. And so Australian politicians are very cunning and canny in working out who are Australians. And Australians are people that vote. And, every election cycle they vote, but they're nowhere near as interested and don't put anywhere near as much time into the analysis of that 3-yearly or 4-yearly vote they have, although in Australia, they're getting disillusioned because whoever they vote in gets undermined. So, even Morison, ultimately wasn't elected in. He was on the long sequence of dislodged of his own party by various factions. And so the political politicking is very dangerous in Australia. But fundamentally, Aussies put more time into reading the horse racing guide form guides and their chosen football, Aussie rules, cricket, rugby, the snow conditions, the surf conditions, whatever their hobby is, gets, unlike most other countries where that people understand the power of a vote in democracy, Aussies don't get that because they don't need to, because the politicians don't innovate, don't think strategically. Aussie politicians just think, what do I have to stay at the lectern? How much time can I get at the lectern? Who can I manipulate under the guise of policy to help people? And so the Labor and Liberal conundrum in Australia is as dangerous to the future of Australia as the polarising Republican Democrat situation in the States. And hopefully that will come as a shock. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, mate.
Well, how do you see Morison's chances in the next elections, especially after the heavy-handed lockdown, which you have aptly described? And I would say it was basically world's biggest cage.
Look, mate, I think that's lockdowns are basically on the authority of state premiers. So Morison's not going to be held guilty for that because the individual premiers, dangerous dictator Dan in Victoria, you've got, the premiers of Western Australia and Queensland trying to increase their popularity by going, we're keeping you safe from the world. When in reality, they're keeping themselves powerful by manipulating society to think they're keeping them safe from the world, when what they're doing is trying to shore up their own power. Morison's going to go down, mate, and he's going to go down because there's only 2 political parties in Australia, and the alternative isn't much better. And is it possible the current Labor Party could lose the unlosable election? Yes. And if people really analysed policy, performance, integrity of governance, then they'd lose this next election. In rugby metaphors, 100-0. But Aussies don't. Aussies will only remember, they'll remember he was in Hawaii having a holiday family during the bushfires. He screwed up vaccination policy. And for 8 years, he said, I do not believe or support climate change policies and reducing emissions. And then in the space of 2 days, had his coalition partner, the National Party, which in theory and historically represents rural Australia and regional Australia, had them suddenly say we support climate change. 3 or 4 weeks ago, Turnbull was on, I'm not going to COP26 in wherever it is in Glasgow. And now he's suddenly got a policy because he's realised if he doesn't have a policy on climate change, he's definitely going to lose the election. He realises that now America, he doesn't have the support of dumbass Trump. And even England and America are now going, hey, listen, Morison, we got rid of one dumbass. Before we get rid of you, you might like to give yourself a fighting chance to survive the next election and flip. Now, ironically, Turnbull, who was the last real leader, the last real person that was elected and popular and had a brain and had courage and had policies, and Kevin Rudd, who was the Labor Prime Minister before him, both knew climate change was a must. Both agreed that we have to set up Australia as a world leader. We got wind, we can produce hydrogen, we can produce solar, where we can be a world leader on the technology, even on the distribution into Asia. But for myopic, narcissistic, personal power games, the Liberal Party went away from that. And that combination of the inner holiday during the bushfires, and we're not talking a bushfire of a few, we're talking areas burning larger than Europe, failing to buy not only the right vaccine, but enough vaccines, and to not give themselves any option, delaying vaccines for months, having to call a military general in to distribute when he's got entire government departments, entire public servants, the highest per cost and per head public service per capita, more politicians per head and per price per capita than any other country in the world, had to get the army, hey, look, army, don't worry about thinking about, planning about strategic threats internationally, humanitarian aids, all the issues going on. Hey, can you just come in and get some trucks and distribute some stuff? And having a general having to say, well, I can't because you don't have anything to distribute. Have you got alternate plans? So Morison's going to go down, mate. Is the Labor Party any better from an integrity perspective at the moment? Yes, it is. And the Liberals trying to cling on to power because they've been staving off a lot of issues pertaining to integrity, the offshore farce with Paladin, a company with no real credibility, getting appointed for millions of dollars of contracts. It's all a farcical joke. And yeah, so look, he's going to go down, mate. Anyway,
yep. I get a feeling that the lack of prominence or the focus on the value of vote, as you may call it, is largely because of the inherent affluence within the Australian society, who have abundance of land and overall resources. Would you agree with that? And that's exactly where India kind of differs, I guess, given the landmass is, of course, Australia is bigger, but India is fairly big too, but there isn't as much resources to go around. I guess that's why the issue of governance, as well as who actually is in power, kind of matters more. And so does the value of vote, which we saw in the last two elections. Would you agree that affluence as well as abundance kind of contributes to that tendency of Australian society?
Yes, look, the apathy of Australians on their vote and the lack of policy, strategy, foresight, vision is because Australia is indeed looking on a short to mid-term the lucky country. Mate, I mean, we've got agriculture, timbers, sustainable timbers, fisheries, but then we've got the resources. We've got uranium in abundance, massive amount of iron ore. We've got coal, we've got gold, we've got a lot of rare earth minerals, we've got untapped resources. So in terms of economic sustainability, just from what we can dig out of the ground, we've got a couple of 100 years of prosperity ahead of us. the reality is, though, the smart people are going, yeah, well, oil, gas, debatably uranium, certainly coal, these are not sustainable things. But Australia has got an ability to produce solar and wind and be producing jobs and prosperity, but it requires a shift in politicians to think long term, but they don't. They think two phase. Phase one, get to the next lectern session. Phase two, get to the next election. And if I get to the lectern 356 days a year, for years in succession, I'll definitely win, because that's how you win polls, according to the latest American pollsters.
Well,
I think,
unfortunately,
yes.
the situation is no better in India. And quite frankly, speaking of climate change, resources, as well as setting up a policy to gain sustainable credibility as far as economy is concerned, or even climate change for that matter, India does offer similar advantages, especially in terms of solar and wind. However, India is let down by its own lack of policy innovation to allow both foreign players as well as the local players to enter the market, which is quite bustling at the moment, even at the global level. Unfortunately, India has been taken to court at the World Trade Center for regulations against the Chinese players. And that has curtailed the overall expansion of the industry as a whole. And that's exactly where the leadership role, or lack thereof, played by the Modi at the center, and several state governments at the state level comes into picture. Why do I bring in Modi here? Is because of his gung-ho attitude towards climate change. He keeps calling himself the leader himself, or India as a country, as a leader in climate change initiatives. And they were among the first to initiate the Paris Agreement, and he played quite a prominent role in Copenhagen as well. Now, the major setback was when Trump came into picture, and his now very famous attitude towards climate change as a whole was a major problem, because India is very well integrated into the American markets, and their focus on climate change, or lack thereof, kind of does matter to India as well. So that's why there was a minor deviation, but the biggest problem remains lack of leadership and regulation. Okay, Indian regulation is known to be highly bureaucratic, highly inefficient, basically acting as a disincentive for private players from entering the market. Unless there is private sector expansion in solar and other alternate sectors, there isn't going to be any progress made on that front. The best example I can give you is the amount of hoops a company like Tesla had to jump through to enter India. Now, the private, or let's say public infrastructure supporting a company like Tesla, which has pioneered alternate technology in mobility, is next to nothing. The only that you won't believe, in the entire country, there are only 4 viable electric car models, only 4, while every other car company in the world are basically rolling out models after models, especially in some of the biggest markets, including Thailand, which is much smaller than India, has got an established Tesla facilities, and not to mention China. I do not know how to explain that. A country which claims to be a leader in climate change initiatives doesn't have the primary prerequisite facilities to support a company like Tesla. In fact, India was supposed to be the first country rolling out red carpets. Of course, they did try, but they are let down by their own impractical regulations. So Modi is at the center of all this, because when he came into power back in 2014, he claimed that he's going to cut the ribbon, the ribbon of regulation. Unfortunately, the ribbon he has entangled himself in the ribbons, various ribbons for that matter. Instead of actually cutting down all the regulations, he's kind of lost. He got lost in regulations, and that has led the entire country down as far as climate change is concerned. And I've not even started on the overall governance aspect.
Well, look, it's funny because what we're seeing in Australia now, both by the Prime Minister, the ruling party, and by most of the premiers, is they get something that has been, particularly in the case of COVID, but also in climate change. They are literally copying lines from the Singapore government, the Korean government, even states such as Taiwan, and initiatives set up by countries such as Vietnam and Thailand. And 8 or 9 months later, when a junior official gets tasked to write a PR line for the next lectern session, the government rolls out these as if it's been policy that's engaged society. So, I mean, the climate change is a classic. On the weekend, the National Party, who's the major or a critical, the only, the major coalition partner to the Liberal government, and was very staunchly, its leader was very staunchly against climate change initiatives and carbon reductions. And basically, the Liberal leader Morison said to the leader of the Nationals, "Look, you go in and pretend to hoo-ha for a while, but if I don't go to Glasgow pretending I've come up with a policy, then we're going to be laughed at by the international community. We're going to be laughed at locally, so we've got no chance to win the election." So, in the space of a day or a weekend, the National Party decided they'd support it, but with various conditions, including putting a complete and utter nincompoop and an anti-climate change. Anti-vaxxers have nothing on the anti-climate change, mate. Ironically, Minister Pitt, and Pitt's he is, now has a position in cabinet. And for all those guys listening to this and going, "Oh, this guy's obviously, a Labor supporter." I'm not. I voted when I did vote before I left the blunder down under. I voted in all elections for the Liberal Party, but the Liberal Party currently, its integrity, its lack of values, its ongoing, masked corruption, its inability to show transparency, have policies, its lack of leadership as such. And the only times I voted for Labor is when they had two forward-thinking visionaries. One was Hawke, one was Keating. Sadly, though, Australians are getting more and more like Americans and getting, they vote for a party for life. Australia, fortunately, unlike America, America's number of swinging voters is way too small. Australia still has enough people, but generally Australia is going down a dangerous path. But Aussie politicians don't engage public servants to, evaluate change, evaluate policy and present it. They're doing it on the hop, and they're looking at daily polls and daily popularity and trying to win little factional battles. So, yes, as sad as that is, I mean, that's the reality, but you're quite right. Australia, because it doesn't have a necessity to think and innovate, it doesn't. Sadly, Twiggy Forrester, Fortescue Minerals, Rio Tinto, a mining company, all these are doing more to make commitments to reduce carbon. And that's sad when industry, particularly from the mining sector, is ahead of your own government, when government should lead policy. It's again showing that, look, Turnbull, wonderful that you go and sing religious songs with your family, and wonderful that you let cameras come in and show you your faith. But I think Australian, frankly, even though all voters have the same power, obviously some voters, political analysts, international analysts, do have a better understanding of these things. But I think even the most die-hard, blind Liberal supporter, ironically, is losing faith in Turnbull, his leadership, and the current government. And that's sad, because traditionally the Liberal Party is the one that looks beyond the politics of the day. It doesn't look to ice cream leadership to give money and give this and give that and appease everybody. Traditionally, it looks long-term strategically about, well, you have to make that money. But really, leadership in Australia is a dying art.
Well, thank you for that. I guess we can go on and on about Modi and Morrison and how inept and inefficient they are. But can we call it a day at this point?
I think so, mate, because my wife's looking at me with raised eyebrows going, hey, where's this dinner date, darling?
Right, Paul. Thanks a lot for that input, Paul. See ya.
Cheers, mate. See you.